court is now in session for the ranking of the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles chapters. Pardon the courtroom lingo, it's just a little bit of lawyer humor. So, the Great Ace Attorney Chronicles is a series of 2 games in the Ace Attorney series, featuring the newbie lawyer, Ryunosuke Naruhodo, as he journeys to the mysterious and fantastical land of London to participate in wacky courtroom hijinks. Recently it has been fully localized after being stuck in Japan-only hell for several years, serving as the first sign of life for the Ace Attorney franchise other than some crossover appearances. The 2 games of the Chronicles series are comprised of 5 chapters each, so naturally I'll be ranking them from worst to best as they fit neatly into a top 10 list, which, as you all know, is the most digestible content delivery package on YouTube. Obviously this list will contain spoilers for the entire franchise, or I guess mostly just for the 2 games. I won't really be tiptoeing around spoilers, at least intentionally, so if you care about that kind of thing, you should probably play the game yourself, and then come back afterwards, we can compare notes. So seriously, but buy the game if you haven't already. This series is in critical condition and needs all the help it can get before Phoenix Wright gets permanently relegated to peddling trading cards, if you know what I'm saying. Starting off the list at number 10, being my personal least favorite chapter from the 2 games, we have The Adventure of the Unbreakable Speckled Band, or 1-2 to use the typical terminology for the categorization, being the second chapter of the first game in the duology. I can't even really refer to it as Case 1-2 as is typical for Ace Attorney series discussion, because of course there is no trial, and so it seems a little inaccurate to call it Case. Well, you know what I mean if I ever slip up and say Case. Anyways, this is a great example of what happens when you take the part of the game that the series is known and beloved for, being, of course, the courtroom trials, with the witnesses and the cross-examinations and the evidence and all that, and remove it for a purely investigative section. Not only that, but the area you're investigating covers 2 nearly identical rooms and 1 hallway, leaving very little visual interest in the surroundings. Well, the case itself isn't all bad. Narratively, it serves its purpose just fine. It introduces key character Herlock Sholmes, the great detective himself, as well as the obligatory killing off of the mentor character, which is oh so common in the Ace Attorney series as well. The chapter itself is a nice reference to the Sherlock Holmes story from which its name is derived. The whole game is full of references to the Holmes canon, which is not something that I picked up on until after I finished the games, because I have not read the books or seen the numerous TV adaptations personally. The Logic and Reasoning Spectacular is a pretty cool segment. It does a lot to spice up the usually kind of dull investigation sections, but it's kind of a case of more style than substance, and almost none of them really have any sort of cognitive difficulty whatsoever. And that's fine, but it doesn't really do a lot of favors for the already kind of dull Speckled Band chapter. Finally, I do have to acknowledge that my opinions of the case did change a little bit when the truth behind Kazuma's disappearance and the incidents on the ship were revealed near the end of the second game. It is pretty neat seeing just how many steps ahead of the game Sholmes was the entire time, all while he was dancing around and climbing the furniture in the cabins. It also does a good job of painting the culprit in a slightly less unfortunate light. At the same time, these explanations do feel a little convoluted or hand-wavy at times. They ultimately don't do a lot to make playing the chapter itself all that more interesting, so last place seems like a fair spot for it. Following up at number 9, I think I'll have to go with The Adventure of the Great Departure, or Case 1-1. Just as a quick aside note, I do think that every entry from this point onwards is generally viewed pretty favorably in my opinion, even amongst the lower ranked entries. So Great Departure is the entry case to the entire duology, so it has a pretty big role to fill, establishing the character of the protagonist, and at this I would say it does a pretty solid job. Debut Ryunosuke is pretty distinctly written as a non-lawyer struggling to keep up in court, versus something like, say, newbie lawyer Phoenix Wright in the first turnabout. The case itself has a pretty decent amount of twists and turns, especially for an intro case. The stakes do feel remarkably high, and the direness of the situation is pretty decently presented, I would say. Or at least as well as it can be when you're staring down a member of the Ouchie clan as opposition. I do think the case does struggle a bit in the pacing department, in that it does feel a little bit dragged out at times, and indeed it does feel notably lengthier than other first cases in the series. Some of the discussion points definitely overstay their welcome or are elaborated on maybe a little bit too much, such as the infamous argument about the 2 steak plates and how long it takes to get to the point where the second plate is actually presented, despite the inspector saying from the outset that he took both the plates, and you get the idea. The ending is also a little bit unsatisfying, as you never do find out about the motive to the murder, at least within the case itself. Unlike in most cases in the series that do make a big deal about motive, this ultimately is to create an overarching mystery for the narrative as a whole, but in a vacuum it does leave this case feeling somewhat lacking. Finally, it is worth mentioning that, like the case of the Speckled Band, looking back on it in hindsight, after beating both the games, does shed some interesting new perspective on the trial, most notably looking at the judge with his knowledge of how he was involved in the events of everything. It's nothing major, but it is something interesting to consider. Next, at number 8, will be The Adventure of the Clouded Kokoro, Case 1-4. Surprisingly, it takes until the 4th chapter to get to the traditional Investigation Day, Trial Day gameplay format. The most profound thing I can say about this case is that it is peak Ace Attorney. It feels the closest to a filler case from the mainline series, as it does feel largely disconnected to the overarching plot of Chronicles. The case also introduces Soseki Natsume, who was actually a real Japanese writer who spent time abroad in Britain. I didn't really know about this while I was playing, but it is neat how the game has both a famous Japanese writer interacting with one of the most famous and powerful Western literature characters, of course being Sherlock Holmes. It's probably poetic in a way, somehow. The witnesses in this case are frankly somewhat unspectacular, although it is the debut episode for Inspector Tobias Gregson, who ends up becoming a vital character and is, in my opinion, the best take on the main detective character archetype in the Ace Attorney series. The other main characters in this case, the Garydub family, were, in my opinion, not super compelling. The minor domestic abuse gimmick that they had going on was a little awkward at times, I must say. That being said, the case itself is probably most noteworthy for being a rare instance of a non-murder trial in the Ace Attorney series, and also how it does tie into Case 2 in the second game in a pretty unique way. After that fantastic segue into number 7, I'm of course talking about the memoirs of the Clouded Kokoro, the aforementioned Case 2-2. If nothing else, this case finally lets us put to bed the question that literary scholars have been wrestling with for ages. Who would win in a fight between Romeo and Juliet? Interestingly, this case takes place chronologically between the 4th and 5th cases of the first game. It is meant to be something of an introduction to the grand overarching plot that I keep mentioning, and that's been slowly building up for the entire series. But the case is actually pretty much entirely unrelated, save for some small details at the very end. Nonetheless, the case itself is pretty solid on its own right, being something of a continuation of 1-4. Soseki Natsume is back, and this time with a much more colorful cast of characters. Sham Spear is a delightfully over-the-top character, and it is also kind of nice to be able to finally meet Olive Green, the hospitalized stabbing victim from the first game. Seeing how the events of the mystery you solved in the first game play into the new mystery in this case is a pretty novel and interesting concept, and for that reason I do think that it deserves its place firmly above 1-4, despite being similar in setting. For number 6, I'm going to have to say it will be Case 2-1, The Adventure of the Blossoming Attorney. So this is also an intro case for the second game, but although it is an intro case, 2-1 has the benefit of being in the sequel game, which means that they had a bit more freedom for big ideas than its predecessor, I think. The first thing, of course, that you'll notice is that you're playing as Susato Mikotaba, the token female judicial assistant for the entirety of the case. And this gives you some unique perspective, and I would say it's a clever reason for the player to be starting over and having to go through the tutorial segments as if you were to play this game first for some reason. But this trial pulls out all the stops, or at least as much as a first trial possibly can. First of all, it marks the return of fan-favorite characters from the last game, Natsume and Inspector Hosonaga, and also having the victim be Giselle Brett, the killer from the previous game's first trial, which I would say sets up a level of tension and mystery. Finally, the game introduces a new mentor character for you for the one chapter, being Yujin Mikotaba, Susato's father. Because of his bluff to make Susato return to Japan, as well as the fact that he seems to be keeping a lot of secrets at the time, the game perhaps sheds a suspicious light on this otherwise friendly man. While he did appear briefly in the first game as well, this trial really sets him up to be a key player in the coming chapters. So ultimately, while it is a neat novelty to play as Susato, the case doesn't really wear out its welcome as much as 1-1, I would say. I do think it is much better paced. And also compared to 1-1, this case has a proper conclusion while still connecting to the overarching plot. So I would say as a standalone chapter and as part of a whole, it does hold up much better. It is a little bit of a shame that Rei, your client, never really shows up again or is mentioned throughout the rest of the game, which I would say is a little bit disappointing, especially considering how prominently she's displayed on the box art. Coming in at number 5, I'm placing Case 2-4, Twisted Karma and His Last Bow. So this might be the first really controversial entry on this list, since the later cases in the games are usually pretty well received. Case 2-4 is somewhat unique in that it is just the first part of what is really the last trial in the game. The chapter ends halfway through the trial, and 2.5 kicks off immediately afterwards from it. Because of this, it is somewhat hard to judge 2.4 objectively on its own, but it still does have its mostly unique witnesses and story beats that can be judged and examined. So the chapter starts off pretty inconspicuously. Yujin and Seishiro, the judge from the Japan court cases of course, come to visit you in London. Right off the bat, to any Ace Attorney longtime eagle-eyed fans, it would seem the game is laying it on pretty thick with the foreshadowing that Yujin will be a victim, or at least, hopefully it wasn't just me picking up on that. But then the game throws a massive curveball rather abruptly. The unexpected character Tobias Gregson, the primary detective, ends up dead. While he did hint at being involved in some shady activity prior to his death, I do believe this is one of the only times in the entire Ace Attorney franchise where a major named character who lived through at least one entire game beforehand ends up being killed off for real. So I would, at least personally, consider this a shocking revelation. To add on to this, Barrick Van Zeeks, the main prosecutor, is the suspect. So finally, the game sheds some light on his tragic backstory and provides a motive for his apparent hatred of Japanese people. The game then launches into the investigation of Gregson's murder, while you really start to uncover the secrets of the Professor case and the Reaper killings, things that have been looming in the background for a while now. And also we get the return of Kazuma Asogi, who was previously thought dead. While he was officially revealed at the epilogue of Case 3, we finally get to face off against him in court, as he is appointed as the prosecutor for this case. So my thoughts on Prosecutor Kazuma are that he's definitely a competent prosecutor, but I do think he ends up being a little bit too hot-headed. The defense-prosecution team-up moments don't really feel quite as impactful as, say, the Wright-Edgeworth impromptu team-up moments, or even the brief moments in previous trials in the game where Van Zeeks relents and helps you take down a troublesome witness. I think it might be perhaps a slight case of tell, don't show, where Kazuma is built up to be a much more important character, but as the player you don't really get much time to know him and appreciate his mannerisms and how they get twisted against you in court. He's still a strong opponent and a good character for sure, but I just think he falls a little flat in some areas. As for the case itself, there isn't a whole lot to unpack since most of the big story beats are saved for Case 5. A lot of the case seems to be introducing Kazuma back into the narrative and setting the foundation for what's to come. In this regard, it does do a pretty good job, but as a standalone chapter, it's simply just pretty good, I would say. The next 3 cases were probably the hardest for me to rank, as I think they're all really good and pretty close in quality, so after some deliberation, for rank 4, I'm going to be placing Case 2-3, The Return of the Great Departed Soul. So this case has a lot going for it. The first thing that immediately jumps out is the grand set pieces that this case features. From the great exhibition stage at the Crystal Tower, which has been teased for many chapters now, to the Wax Museum, which serves as the focal point for some of the most creative and interesting story beats in the game, and let's not forget Drebber's Science Lab, which is home to one of Sholmes' greatest deductions. The story relevance this case has is also pretty significant. Something like the head of the forensics team being the true culprit of a murder is like Case 5 endgame level twists. And this game just casually throws it at the tail end of the trial, like, oh, by the way, that creepy mad scientist you've been chasing the entire trial? He's not the actual killer. This only serves to further increase the significance of the Professor plotline, which you're just starting to really learn about, and just how deep that rabbit hole goes. Finally, through your client, Albert Harebrain, you finally get to see the more personable side to Van Zieks, which really starts to help develop him as a character. It was great seeing him casually throw out with a straight face that the teleportation machine was indeed a legitimate success, just so he could support his friend's hypothesis. I would say just about everything in this trial is done pretty well. The logic is tricky and definitely convoluted in some places, but other than that, everything else is pretty high quality, relative to the usual Ace Attorney standards, I would say. Going back to the 2-day investigation trial loop, does make the case feel pretty lengthy, and it does feel a bit dragged out at times since so much time is spent looking into the mechanisms behind the machines. Finally, it was really neat to see Gina return as a trainee inspector, no less, with her own cute mascot dog. Moving on to number 3, it's going to be Case 1-5, The Adventure of the Unspeakable Story. So we get to the final case of the first game, and what a way to end it is. This case wraps up some of the subplots that were present within the first game, namely the McGilded plotline that was left kind of as a mystery, and it sets up as a hook to resolve in the sequel. Despite this, the case really does feel like a proper conclusion in its own right. It definitely doesn't feel too cliffhangery, even if it does pose some new questions at the end, which I can appreciate even if us playing in English got the option of jumping immediately into Game 2 from the get-go. The case itself is quite a lengthy one. It starts off spending some quality time with Sholmes and Iris in a London slice-of-life episode. Things go sour when the mystery of the unpublished manuscript, The Hound of the Baskervilles, is brought up. While ultimately it's not super relevant to the case, it's a nice nod to the Professor plot that the second game features, and one of the first big teases of something big lurking beneath the surface. Then when we move into the murder of the pawn shop owner, the case starts going off the rails. Sholmes gets incapacitated, Susato gets summoned back to Japan, and this leaves you with just Iris as your judicial assistant, although she can carry her own weight in that regard. Then the case goes from what seems to a normal everyday shooting murder into dealing with classified government secrets, shady dealings, and how it ties back to Case 3 with McGilded and the murder in the omnibus. Despite the stakes being raised up so high, Ryunosuke still fights through to defend his client because of his trust in Gina, showing a great amount of character development in both characters. The case boasts a great blend of drama and mystery, as well as the moments of light-hearted humor that the Ace Attorney series is quite known for. The Skulkin brothers might overstay their welcome in the eyes of some, but they're still quite entertaining. They have their moments, and their dynamic with Gregson and the culprit Graydon are pure gold. Speaking of Graydon, he's a solid final boss villain, while interestingly not even being the true main villain of the first game. I would argue that honor goes to Mr. McGilded himself. He was difficult to take down, and the game takes great advantage of the multi-witness feature by having the interactions between the witnesses on the stands be important points to capitalize on, such as when Gregson shakes down one of the Skulkin brothers to hide some evidence. It's quite unfortunate this feature wasn't really brought back ever in a meaningful way. When you do finally take down Graydon, you're treated to one of the best and only witness breakdowns in the game, but I would say it's one of the better ones across the entire franchise. Again, really taking advantage of having multiple witnesses on the stand at once. So, with that said, second place appropriately goes to The Adventure of the Runaway Room, Case 1-3. If it should be controversial that this case is ranked so high, pray forgive the discourtesy. This is the first non-tutorial trial case in Ace Attorney Chronicles, and boy does it live up to expectations. So this is another trial that does not feature an investigation period, and honestly, when they're done right, I do kind of prefer those. Outside of the tutorial cases, it can be tricky balancing going right into a full-length non-tutorial trial with very limited information, but Runaway Room does a pretty good job of getting the player acclimated, I would say. So what starts off as a relatively simple closed room murder mystery ends up having a lot more shady secrets behind it. This isn't necessarily a huge deviation for Ace Attorney, but the fact that your client, Magnus McGilded, is the true culprit all along is a pretty interesting twist. This is also something that the Ace Attorney series has played with in the past, the notion of an actually guilty client. But in my opinion, McGilded is handled much more interestingly than Matt on Guard, as good as that trial was. McGilded's trial has a lot more doubt and suspicion cast over it, combined with the fact that unlike Phoenix Wright's defense of Matt on Guard, you don't really know for sure what happened the entire time. Wright was coerced into fighting for the acquittal to save Maya's life, whereas there isn't really quite the same force at play in McGilded's trial. I mean, there is the fact that Ryunosuke's lawyer career is riding on his victory, but that plot point seems to be all but forgotten halfway through the case. The case shedding major suspicion on McGilded's character from the start by bringing up his shady loan shark practices, and then having him kind of bounce between guilty and innocent in the eyes of the jury, makes for a very tense and suspenseful flow of the trial, and is in my opinion probably the best implementation of the jury. It's also the first implementation of the jury in the series, but it does the best job at it. My only real gripe is that they do lay it on a little thick near the end, with McGilded doing his big evil laugh and cursing his own defense when Ryunosuke starts to express doubt. But at that point, that combined with the game hitting you over the head with the moral dilemma and the tampered evidence, it is a little unambiguous that McGilded was the culprit before the trial is officially over. Also notably in this case is the introduction of Barrick Van Zeeks, who is quite possibly my favorite prosecutor in the Ace Attorney series, or at least one of them. He's a threatening opponent without being too over-the-top antagonistic, and he is a graceful loser. This case does a pretty good job introducing him. Finally, the number one case in the Ace Attorney Chronicles duology, by process of elimination of course, we have the resolve of Ryunosuke Naruhodo, or Case 2-5. It would just feel wrong to have the true final case not be ranked number one, right? But other than its placement in the timeline, the case really does earn its rank. So this case, of course, is a continuation of 2-4, further investigating the murder of Inspector Gregson, as well as finally learning the mystery of the Reaper of the Bailey and the Professor case that took place 10 years prior. That's a lot of loose ends that all conveniently get wrapped up in a neat little murder bow in this thrilling conclusion. But what I feel ultimately sells this case as number one, in my eyes at least, is finally getting the payoff for Herlock Sholmes' character. It's been building for 2 entire games as he's been either goofing around or keeping secrets. but we finally get to see the grand reveal of the great detective in top form, and boy was it definitely worth the wait. One of the best scenes in the game was Sholmes finally getting to work again with his trusted partner, Yujin Mikotaba, or Japanese Watson, and performing a flawless deduction instantly to find Seishiro so he could be subpoenaed as a witness. A grown-ass man tap dancing has never been so epic. The true mastermind behind everything, Lord Mael Strongheart, is finally revealed as well. Many people were somewhat disappointed at how obvious of a reveal it was, and I do sort of feel the same way. I think the fact that it was a foregone conclusion was probably intentional so that the other plot twists would be able to shine more effectively. Perhaps most notably the reveal of the true identity of the professor, of course being Clint Van Zeeks, Barrick's older brother. While this case does somewhat fall into the same trappings as a lot of final cases do, where the final boss is, of course, so tenacious that it makes the trial feel like it drags on a bit while you throw everything at him to take him down, I feel the pacing was generally a little bit better than typical last cases. Having the abrupt conclusion of Herlock calling in the power of the Queen of England herself helped a bit, delivering a decisive final blow rather than the endless, suffocating struggle of using every piece of evidence you have at your disposal. Well, you still do that, but then there's also the whole final blow thing. All in all, a fantastic conclusion to the series. It really let all the characters shine, except arguably Kazuma, who felt kind of like a bystander who was just there to get angry. Well, anyways, that's the list. It ended up being quite a lengthy script, but I suppose that is fitting considering the nature of the game in review. Thanks for watching.